By the end of 1918, four empires had vanished in just months: German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman. This was not random. It was a chain reaction. How did drawing new borders on paper turn Europe into a permanent fault line of tension and fear? The real turning point is not where most people think, and I will show it in Act 3, in the middle of this film. Quick recap. This is about decisions and consequences, not accidents. By the end of this documentary, you will understand exactly why modern Europe still runs on the operating system of World War I. Between 1918 and 1920, the map of Europe became almost unrecognizable. In the space once controlled by sprawling empires, 9 new countries appeared: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Austria, and Hungary. Each raised its own flag and claimed a place on the world stage, but behind the symbols, the reality was fragile. Most of these states had little or no experience with independent government. Parliaments and constitutions were drafted in haste. Civil servants, judges, and police were often drawn from old imperial structures or thrown together from rival factions, which meant institutions lacked cohesion and legitimacy. Because institutions were weak, political coalitions fell apart, leaving governments vulnerable to crises and to radical movements. Quick recap: new borders did not automatically produce stable governments. Poland had been divided for over a century, and its new borders were still contested by neighbors, which produced diplomatic tension and regular border incidents. Czechoslovakia combined Czechs, Slovaks, and sizable minorities who had never shared a single administration, so integrating diverse populations became a constant challenge. Yugoslavia tried to unite Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes under a single monarchy despite deep religious and linguistic divisions, and those divisions translated directly into political strain. In the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania scrambled to build governments while fighting Bolshevik forces from the east. Austria and Hungary, stripped of their imperial holdings, shrank into small, uncertain republics. On paper, these new states promised democracy and self-determination. In practice, most struggled with unstable coalitions, weak institutions, and constant threats from within and from without. The old order was gone, but nothing truly solid had replaced it. That fragility did not vanish quickly, and it set the stage for escalation across the continent. What happens next shows how these weak foundations turned into long-term crises. In early 1918, as Finland declared independence from the Russian Empire, the country split violently between two camps. On one side stood the Reds, workers and tenant farmers inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, supported with arms and advisors from Soviet Russia. Opposing them were the Whites, led by former Tsarist officers and backed by German troops eager to expand influence in the north. What began as a political standoff turned into a full-blown civil war. In just 4 months, nearly 38,000 people died, more than 1% of Finland's population at the time. Quick recap: independence brought freedom, and it brought catastrophe. Executions, hunger, and disease swept through towns and countryside alike. Entire families were caught between shifting front lines. The fighting ended in May, with the White victory and the arrival of German forces in Helsinki. But the scars ran deep. Thousands of Reds were sent to prison camps, and memories of betrayal and retribution lingered for generations. Finland's civil war was one example. The pattern repeated across the new states of Europe: fragile governments, outside intervention, and a staggering human cost. The future of these countries depended not just on new borders, but on whether societies could survive the trauma of being born in violence. Next, we trace how those fragile beginnings hardened into lasting political fault lines. When the Paris Peace Conference opened in 1919, diplomats faced a continent shattered by war and the collapse of empires. Their task was to draw new borders for emerging states, but the reality on the ground was far more complex than any map could show. Strategic priorities and economic interests often outweighed the principle of self-determination. Railways, rivers, and coal mines shaped the lines as much as language or culture. In Czechoslovakia, the new border cut through regions where over 3 million Germans lived. The Sudetenland shifted almost overnight from the center of the Habsburg world to the edge of a new state. In Transylvania, the decision to award the region to Romania left 1.7 million Hungarians as a minority, their villages suddenly on the wrong side of a new frontier. The Polish corridor gave Poland access to the sea, but it isolated hundreds of thousands of Germans from their homeland. The city of Danzig became a free city under international supervision, pleasing no one. Quick recap. Borders were negotiated for politics, not people. In the east, the Vilnius region, claimed by both Poland and Lithuania, was assigned to Poland despite a Lithuanian majority, deepening resentment that would simmer for decades. Millions became minorities overnight, their daily lives upended by decisions made in distant halls. These new borders were meant to stabilize Europe, but they often froze old conflicts in place. The human cost was measured not just in census tables, but in mounting grievances that would echo through the next generation. These frozen lines would not stay frozen, and they set the stage for the next wave of escalation. On June 28, 1919, German delegates signed the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors. The document ran over 200 pages, but one sentence would haunt Germany for decades: Article 231. In a single line, Germany accepted full responsibility for causing the war and all its damage. The Allies insisted on that clause as the legal foundation for demanding reparations. The final bill was $33 billion, a figure so vast it equaled several years of German national income. This was not just about money. The treaty stripped Germany of its colonies, handed Alsace-Lorraine back to France, and imposed strict limits on the army: no tanks, no submarines, no more than 100,000 soldiers. Inside Germany, Article 231 became a rallying cry. Newspapers called it the shame clause. Politicians across the spectrum denounced the treaty as a diktat, a dictated peace forced at gunpoint. The sense of humiliation was immediate and widespread. Reparations payments strained the economy, fueling inflation and wiping out savings. By 1923, a loaf of bread in Berlin could cost billions of marks. The psychological blow was just as severe. Many Germans believed they had been stabbed in the back by their own leaders and betrayed by the world. Radical parties fed on this anger, promising to tear up Versailles and restore national pride. Quick recap. A legal finding of responsibility became a political symbol, and that symbol turned economic pressure into social anger. The logic of punishment, written into the treaty text, set off a chain reaction that changed German politics and ultimately the fate of Europe. This punishment would not stop with Versailles. It would become the fuel for the next crisis. By 1939, the unfinished business of the First World War erupted into a second, even more destructive conflict. This was an escalation that would rewrite borders and lives. Nazi Germany's leaders openly aimed to overturn the Treaty of Versailles, reclaim lost territories, and redraw borders once again. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 triggered a continent-wide war, not as a fresh crisis, but as the next phase of old disputes left unresolved. Quick recap. Unresolved settlements and punitive peace terms fed a politics of revision and revenge. As fighting spread from Paris to Stalingrad, millions were displaced, and the lines drawn in 1919 were shattered and redrawn by force. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Europe was split in two. The Iron Curtain descended from the Baltic to the Adriatic, dividing the Soviet-controlled East from the American-backed West. States that had struggled for independence after 1918, including Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic countries, now found their sovereignty limited by Moscow. For nearly half a century, barbed wire and watchtowers enforced a tense standoff, freezing the continent's old fractures in place. The map looked stable, but the fault lines remained just below the surface, waiting for the next shock. What came next would force Europe to build new institutions and alliances, and it would reveal how deeply the First World War had reshaped the continent. In April 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating NATO. The goal was simple: make sure no single country could threaten the continent again. Collective defense meant an attack on one would be answered by all. It was a direct answer to the isolation and rivalry that had fueled the last two wars. 2 years later, the European coal and steel community began tying the economies of France, West Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries together. By 1957, The Treaty of Rome expanded this experiment into the European Economic Community, laying the groundwork for what would become the European Union. These projects tried to lock old rivals into cooperation, using trade and defense to keep the peace where treaties and borders had failed. Quick recap. NATO provided collective deterrence, and economic integration tried to make war irrational by binding rivals through trade and institutions. Yet even as these institutions took shape, their limits were exposed. In the 1990s, Yugoslavia, once held together by force and diplomacy, collapsed into a series of brutal wars. Borders that had been drawn after World War I became front lines again. Ethnic cleansing, siege warfare, and mass graves echoed the unresolved tensions of earlier decades. Institutions could contain some risks, but they could not erase the fault lines written into Europe's map. That inability to erase fault lines would not disappear quietly, and it would shape security choices for decades to come. Europe's map remains a patchwork of unfinished debates and fragile borders, shaped by decisions made over a century ago. As lines harden and old fears resurface, the unresolved legacy of 1919 still dictates policy and identity. The past is not behind. It is the code running beneath today's headlines.